on the university's Student Senate, and am a member of Chi Omega National Women's Fraternity. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel. You can also access videos of past programs by visiting our YouTube channel. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system or at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. After the program, we'll have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you're able and just ask one brief question. If you are part of our virtual audience, you may submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. Now, please join me in welcoming Director Audrey Coleman.
Thank you, Cammie, for that great introduction. It's wonderful to see you all tonight for what is really the culmination of our student programming season. I just couldn't be prouder of the group that we have this year. Our Student Advisory Board Coordinator is Kenna McNally, and I will introduce her at a bit more length in a moment, but I just want to thank her for her leadership this semester, and she's just done an outstanding job. I want to be sure and thank Sarah Stacy, who is our Student Advisory Board Coordinator on staff here, and she does a fantastic job with these students. We have so much to look forward to with this group of students as our next generation of leaders. So I will look forward to our conversation that Kenna has designed, recruited all of the speakers for, and she's going to do a fantastic job at moderator. So before I turn it over to Kenna, who is a junior studying digital marketing, communications, public policy, and business, she's additionally the policy and communications intern for the Kansas Action for Children, a bipartisan organization dedicated to improving the lives of Kansas kids and families. So this conversation is right in line with her interests, and she's done a fantastic job preparing. Before we begin our program this evening and I turn it over to Kenna, I want to remind you all that we've got a few upcoming programs. Next Wednesday, April 9th at 4 p.m., we'll be hosting the final session of our spring discussion group series with Mr. Beat, YouTuber Matt Beat, who's also a public educator, and he has brought along a series of very interesting guests to examine the question, exactly how much power does an American president have? And we are going to be doing our last installment in which we examine, or Mr. Beat will examine the power of the electorate over the presidency. So that should be a very interesting conversation. His guests will be Walter Clapp of the No Cap Fund and Sarah Wolk of the Equal Vote Coalition. On Wednesday, April 16th at 7 p.m., please plan to join us for our annual Dole Lecture here at the Institute, our signature program that commemorates the date in which Bob Dole was wounded on the battlefields of Italy. This marks, 2025 marks 80 years since that date, and in honor of that anniversary, we will welcome former staffers Sheila Burke, Rod DeArmond, and Robert Lighthizer to reflect on the Senator's leadership, and particularly economic and political leadership during the 1980s and 90s during the Reagan era and really the height of Bob Dole's power. So you won't want to miss that one. And finally, for those of you who have young folks in your lives of all ages, please don't miss celebrating Easter with us on April 19th for our annual Easter egg roll with Dole from 10 to 1. One of our most fun and well-anticipated events all year. Egg rolls, hunts, crafts activities, rabbits, and more. Yes, real rabbits, not a person in a bunny suit. Now you know why it's so popular. Without further ado, my pleasure to turn the floor over to Kenna McNally to introduce her guests and begin our discussion this evening. Kenna.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for that very kind introduction. And thank you guys all for joining us this evening for this important discussion on education in Kansas. I'm so pleased to introduce you to tonight's guests. So first, we have Kansas State Senator Doug Schoen, who represents the 37th Senate District, which includes northern Miami County and southwestern Johnson County. Senator Schoen is passionate about education, possessing a doctorate of veterinary medicine and a doctorate of philosophy in production medicine and epidemiology. He became active in education policy after serving on the Lewisburg USD 416 Board of Education. As a freshman senator serving on the Education Committee, he has become a new leading voice on state education policy. And to his left, we have Kansas State Representative Mary Lynn Poskin, who was elected to represent Kansas House District 20 in 2020. Mary Lynn is a Kansan by choice, choosing to put down roots here in the aftermath of 9/11 after pursuing a corporate relocation lifestyle for many years. She and her husband David have a blended family of 7 children who spent a total of 90 years in K-12 classrooms, 62 of which were in Kansas public schools, making them her top legislative priority. David has secondary progressive MS and is in a wheelchair full-time, and Mary Lynn is his primary caregiver, giving her firsthand insight on the struggles of living with chronic disease and the importance of access to healthcare and growing its workforce. Before joining the legislature, Representative Poskin worked for 20 years in higher education, including trade, community, and 4-year colleges. And last but certainly not least, we have Brett Parker, who worked in Kansas schools as a classroom aide, substitute teacher, and classroom teacher before being elected to the Kansas House of Representatives in 2016. After leaving the House, Brett has worked for Kansas National Education Association, supporting and advocating for educators in the greater Kansas City area in Kansas. So I'm so honored to have the 3 of you joining me this evening for this conversation. And to start us off with a bit of a softball, all 3 of you have experience in education, either at the K-12 level or in higher education. So starting with you, Senator Shane, can you tell us a little bit more about your background in education?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for being here tonight. Thank you for the opportunity to be with the Dole Institute. I joked around with my kids that Dad will be okay tonight. As the Republican senator coming to Lawrence with K-State plates on my tag, things will be just fine in Lawrence, Kansas. So it's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the question. My background in education, I mean, it obviously goes back to my childhood, being in Kansas public schools, being in the suburban Blue Valley School District, and then eventually finding myself in my high school years in the rural community of Lewisburg. And seeing the differences between those districts from, being the child in those districts and the young learner in those districts. Being in higher education, both, completing 2 doctorate degrees and currently working as a teaching professor at K-State, I have a vantage point of what are higher education institutions bringing in their freshman classes, and what are we seeing on the post-secondary side. And that experience has been very, very important to informing my understanding of the challenges and the opportunities that we have in the K-12 side as well. My experience on the USD 416 Board of Education gave me really positive insight into learning things to do and things not to do. That was some of my earliest opportunities in government leadership. But it gave me the opportunity to understand the challenges and intricacies when it comes to the governing body of a local public school, and the challenges that come with being on a board of education and the responsibility that holds. Everything from the budget to policy decisions to disciplinary measures. It's an important role and often an underappreciated one, and that has been formative in forming my positions as a senator.
And Representative Poskin, what about you?
Thank you, and thanks again for having us here this evening. Gosh, education has been central to my entire life, and again, starting as a young student, my father was an Air Force career pilot, and so I personally was in public schools, Alabama, California, Nebraska, all over the country. And then when my children started in schools, my ex-husband relocated corporately every 18 to 24 months. So I also have the parental experience from public schools in New Hampshire, again in Florida, Texas, Illinois, all over the place. And when 9/11 happened, I decided that it was time to put down roots for my children. And in the hospitality industry, there's work across the entire world. We could have picked anywhere. We came to Kansas on purpose to be the place where we'd raise our children for the quality of life, for the outstanding educational opportunities, and the work that was available. My ex-husband opened the Overland Park Convention Center. So we've been there for a long time, and one of the things that happened within a few years of relocating was that the school funding kind of started going down. I had children in special ed, and they were trying to say, oh, he doesn't need speech therapy anymore. And I also worked in higher education for 20 plus years and was working at Johnson County Community College as we started seeing these budget cuts and It's like, kind of, what's going on? And I had always been very involved in the schools at the PTA level. I invented a snow day game where we threw cotton balls, and the first team that could cover their school with cotton got a snow day. So just was always super, super involved. And it was after I moved to Kansas that I became a little more aware of how policymakers influence and why were Kansas schools, some of the top to pick from. So as I mentioned, I worked at Johnson County Community College for nearly a decade, and I had not envisioned a future in politics. In fact, as an academic advisor there, we had a personality survey that you might be familiar with, Clifton Strength Finders, and students would maybe complain about what their strengths were or some of the potential vocations that they might pursue. And I used to joke with them, I'd say, you guys, mine says I should be a politician. And that would break the ice. We'd all laugh. And I'd say, that is the last thing I'm going to be. And I believe that this will probably be the last job that I pursue on a full-time basis. So I was asked to run in 2020 by school advocates, very specifically in Blue Valley and in Shawnee Mission that I represent now. And I was able to make a lot of connections between what I came to Kansas for and some of the policies that were denigrating some of those qualities. And so I ran for office with the idea that I was going to be preserving and making all of those characteristics of Kansas that made me choose it out of any state in the entire nation to remain the hallmark of the Sunflower State. And it's an absolute honor to get to do that. Thank you.
And Brett, what about you?
So I have worked throughout public education. I student taught high school history, graduated into the Great Recession, and there were not a lot of high school social studies jobs at that time. So I worked as an ELL aide, I worked as a para-educator, I long-term subbed middle school science, and eventually landed as an elementary school ELL teacher. So I taught speakers of other languages. So I've been through just about each level and each role within the public education system. When I landed at the elementary school, that has not my career path I thought I was heading down, and what struck me was just the magic that my colleagues could do. The veteran first grade teacher who could take 25 6-year-olds and get them to do whatever they needed, and I was this floundering person who had just walked into elementary education for the first time. And what I saw at that time too was, as Mary Lynn referenced, it was around a time of some frozen budgets for Kansas public schools, and I was seeing some of those great magicians of public education starting to question whether they were going to stay in it for the last 10 years of their career. And it wasn't because they weren't getting paid more, though I'm sure that would have helped. A lot of it was just about the resources that were disappearing for some of the students, and a frustration of, I used to be able to get this group from point A to point B in the school year, and we're not having the resources, or class sizes are getting bigger, or just the needs are growing. And I thought, it's going to be a long time before I ever, if ever, can work the magic that they do. But there's probably some work to be done to help keep great people in that career and support them. So I got very involved with our local teachers union, Olathe NEA at that time. And as I helped do contract negotiations, got to know some of our district administrators. It's pretty intimidating when you're a third-year teacher sitting across from the superintendent in contract negotiations, but it was a good life experience. And what we really discovered was we had a really friendly Board of Education. We had pretty friendly administration. The problems were not local, they were mostly coming from the state. And I think, as probably a lot of people who have gotten into running for office can attest, my first thought was, well, someone should do something about this, and I'm going to find them and I will help them do that. And then you start looking around and asking, who's going to do it, and then everyone starts turning the question back at you. So it was a long process of sorting that out. And I was actually thinking when I walked in here, probably one of the steps on that journey was attending a Dole Institute 2014 election panel, probably October of that year. And so I'm excited to get to come back and be a part of one of these. And participate in just a good discussion about getting different perspectives on an important topic of the day.
Well, thank you for joining us again. So you've all sort of began to touch on it, but what do you see as the most pressing issue in education at the state level right now? Starting with you, Senator Shane.
That's a tough question because there's a number of challenges, and everything from societal challenges and what our teachers are dealing with day in and day out with mental health and the differences in children these days, increasing need for special education support. I think I'll speak functionally for the state. Our state has a lot of really diverse needs when it comes to our public schools. We have a number of districts that are in shrinking communities that have facilities that are falling apart, and they're unable to get bond initiatives passed because of the shrinking tax base and the relative tax burden that those citizens are facing. And then we have explosive growth districts like are in Senate District 37, which are growing at such a rapid pace that we recently had a $100 million bond, actually was that yesterday, 2 days ago, in Gardner, that passed to help support a new elementary school and some other capital improvements for the district. And so there's a huge diversity of needs. Functionally for the state, our central challenge will remain is how do we satisfy our educational interests for the state and our public education institutions with those diverse needs, with our fiscal challenges in the state as well. And that's going to be kind of the central policy challenge that we have going forward. How do we address and how do we alleviate that so that our schools are in a good position and our state is also simultaneously in a good position when it comes to our state's primary investment. It is our #1 investment in Kansas. And I think that's going to be the ongoing conversation is how can we be agile enough and adjust practice and policy to meet the ever-changing needs of education as we continue to move into 2025 and beyond.
And to you, Representative Boskin.
Thank you. It is multi-pronged and a very difficult question to answer in 3 minutes or less. And you've got a look at what is going on in our schools, and then another prong of what we're doing about schools and the policy that we're passing in the legislature. So at the school level, one of the things that is an issue across the nation and developed even more deeply after COVID is chronic absenteeism. No matter what amazing teachers we have, if they are not in school, they cannot learn. So we hear from all of our districts that chronic absenteeism is an issue. We also have a teacher shortage, unlike the recession when you came, and that is, again, something that is nationwide. We are close to 2,000 teachers short across the state of Kansas. And so we have teachers, or we have people that are supposed to be licensed teachers that don't have licenses that are filling some of our positions. That's very difficult. And then when you've got students with more needs and students that don't come to school prepared to learn, we've probably got some psych majors out there that know about Maslow's theory of hierarchy. If they're not fed, if they're not well taken care of at home, that makes it more difficult for them to learn. So we've got those challenges in our school districts. Also with the budget squeezes, not funding special education, but having that be the priority that has to be funded and pulling other funds away. So that is, I think, what is facing our schools there. And then part of what's happening in the legislature is that we are and have habitually reneged on our commitment to children. We put out unfunded mandates. We say that things need to be done. We know how to raise reading scores. We know that the old way of reading instruction in our higher education institutions is not the best way to do it. And last year we passed the Blueprint for Literacy. It was supposed to have $10 million a year for the next 5 years to train 3,000 teachers a year who are interacting with our elementary and reading age students. And that has gone to zero. It was $10 million last year, unfunded. We started on a 4-year plan for special education to get it up to statutory funding. It was $75 million this year. The Senate passed a budget with 0. I think at the moment we're to 10, but that leaves us still at 73%. So I think our legislature needs to remember to stay in its lane and remember its commitments and not spend so much time on culture war legislation.
Well, my perspective comes from my day job now, working and supporting educators and in the Kansas City area. But I think one of the biggest challenges is if you ask educators now, would they advise their children to go into teaching? A shocking number of them would say no. They'd say, I love my job and this is my career and I've chosen it, and hopefully are sticking it out, but they're not recommending it as a career to go in. And that's a challenge. As the representative mentioned, we have a teaching shortage. It was when I student taught, my cooperating teacher, who was my mentor in my student teaching, couldn't stay at the building we were at because they were cutting positions. Now, if you're a student teacher, you probably get hired while you're still student teaching before they even know where they're going to place you. They just know there's fierce competition to hire in those graduates, and there just aren't enough of them. So that results in some classrooms, being taught in some districts around the state with folks who don't have that training and the license. The flip side of the teaching shortage is there are, I think we looked at these numbers at work a couple of years ago, and there were like 30,000 licensed teachers who are not choosing to work in the profession. So there are the folks with the credentials who could be doing the work, but for all the reasons that have been cited, there are challenges to going into that career path and then making it a career. And part of that's challenges in public education. Part of it's just the way that folks approach careers now, right? Used to be if you hired a third grade classroom teacher and treated them well, they might spend 30 years teaching in a district. Anymore, there's a decent chance they'll do it for 5 or 10 years, and even if they're having a good experience, they may be looking for what's the next step in their career, what are they going to do differently. So there's no magic solution to that, but I think it's an ongoing challenge. I mean, the public education depends on having strong public educators, and we need to be making it a more enticing career path and then supporting the folks who go into it.
And I'm going to toss this one right back to you, Brett, but who needs so there are a lot of stakeholders in education: parents, students, teachers, the state, boards of education, all of these people. When we're talking about this issue of there's not enough teachers or teachers are not choosing to stay in the profession for as long as they used to, how do we bring all of these stakeholders to the table and balance their interests in creating and sort of fixing this problem, even though there is not an easy fix?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, everyone has a stake in it. Our society has a stake in having strong public education, even if you don't have your own kids in public schools. It's just a foundational piece of, who we are, especially in the state of Kansas. I think we need folks to be more engaged. I think education becomes a politicized issue, and that discourages people across the spectrum from getting involved in a meaningful way. That's why I'm so excited about an event like tonight, just to have a public forum, right? To be able to discuss things. We need support from state legislatures. The federal government is dropping the ball and has been for a long time on, especially on special education funding. I think everyone needs to step up, but part of that is acknowledging that we're headed for a crisis, and having that sense of urgency that, parents, school boards, legislatures, communities, all can rally around that. And look, being a state legislator is a thankless task at times. Being a school board member is certainly a thankless task at times, certainly an unpaid task all the time. So there are people doing good work and caring about the issue, but I think the political battles over it probably steer a lot of people away from it when we need everyone to be digging in.
And Senator Shane, you have experience on your local Board of Education as well as at the state. From both of those perspectives, as well as a parent, there's a lot of discussion around accountability in education, making sure that we are providing students with the quality education and maintaining good relationships and quality work environments for everyone else. Who do you see as needing to be held accountable, and who is holding these people accountable?
Well, thank you for the loaded question. At the end of the day, really all the stakeholders in education are accountable for some various aspect at the end of the day. I think that we probably underemphasize the role and the authority of a local board of education. And there's these, I'd say, conflicting messages, in my view, in public education where we try to force everybody to a central standard of some kind, right? So accrediting standard or what have you, and we try to make everybody kind of do the same things. But that board of education then largely, you know, they're volunteers, they don't have a lot of experience, they certainly don't have governmental or policy experience. But at the end of the day, they're the ones that are the most accountable to their communities and to our state. They're the ones that are directing the spend, you know, the spend of the funds. They're the ones that are ultimately responsible for the hiring and the leadership decisions at the district. And they hold an immense responsibility on their shoulders, and that should be recognized and respected. But we simultaneously try to steer everybody to doing the same things. I've said one of the greatest challenges in good, accountable public education is that we're trying to force everybody to a same standard. We're, by policy, kind of prohibiting competition and creativeness to try to arrive at the best outcomes, right? And that's the kind of system and environment I'd like to see us foster. At the end of the day, we as the legislature, we're the statutory and the state policy body, we're the appropriative body, right? We're responsible for that. That's what we need to be held accountable for. The Board of Education needs to be held accountable to wisely expending the taxpayers' funds. That includes local and state taxpayer funds, including federal taxpayer funds. They need to be accountable to their communities for having policies, good policies in place that work for the benefit of their staff and the benefit of the children that are entrusted to their educational care. And they're responsible and accountable to their local taxpayers. Also, something that needs to be hopefully a greater focus for Kansas moving into the future and for our country is the focus on family and parental accountability and engagement, being a part of their child's academic and educational journey. The more that we can pull parents in to that educational experience for their child and involve them in it is really important. And from my perspective, that's been one of our areas that we've struggled in the United States, is that in some ways we want to kind of push the parents out, but in other ways we want to pull them in. And I really think we need to be accountable to pulling them in, and then also hold our parents accountable to being part of their child's educational journey, because that's really probably the primary driver of a kid's academic success, is that parental and family involvement. And without that, not to say that a kid won't succeed, but it certainly makes it much more challenging.
And Representative Boskin.
Yes, so there are multitudes of stakeholders, and absolutely every stakeholder has accountability and responsibility for what their part is. As the parent of 7 children, I can't agree more that the parent is one of the primary stakeholders in our schools. And I can tell you that in the school districts that I represent, they are invited. They are part of the strategic planning as our students. In fact, it was our students that made a point that mental health needed to be part of the strategic plan. So our school districts, the ones that I represent, are listening. And so students and parents are primary stakeholders. My sister is a special ed teacher in the state of Oklahoma, has been for 30 years, and she has a sign on her desk that says, "Lack of preparation on your part doesn't constitute an emergency on mine." And I love that, and I've used it on my 7 kids quite a bit. So we've got that level. And then, of course, there are the locally elected school boards, and those are your neighbors. Those are parents of the kids in your schools, and those are specialists in what works for your district. So they do also have a lot of responsibility. We have a state board of education that is also duly elected. And then we have the legislature, and we, of course, are the money holders, and we do the appropriations. So one of the things is that the Kansas Constitution kind of sets out the responsibilities and so forth, and who is in charge of what. And you might find that the legislature is not responsible for the minutiae that the local school district is for and that the State Board of Education is for. And the thought about relationships between these stakeholders is very, very important. And since I arrived in 2021, I have been on at least one House Education Committee, whether it was the education policy in the last 2 years. And this year I serve on the K-12 Budget Committee. And you may or may not be aware that the K-12 Budget Committee has been a source of contention across the state between stakeholders and a very ugly place for teachers to come and for teachers to testify. And I would like to give a shout out to our K-12 chairman for trying to change that and inviting stakeholders in and providing equal time for voices, because in the legislature we need to hear from teachers. And I don't know if I'm telling on you, but you used to say that when KNEA would come, it's like the redcoats are coming. And by the way, I wore red for Ed. But teachers would leave the Capitol extremely distressed about what they heard about their profession, that they are characterized as the reason our schools are failing. And we really need to stop that kind of discourse, and we're getting there in the K-12 budget. One of the things I want to point out, though, is that as part of that outreach to our stakeholders, maybe 2.5 weeks ago, we had a meeting where we invited local school boards from across the state. No bill to hear, just to have a talk with the local school boards. And what do you need from us? What do you want from us? And back and forth and like that. And one of the school boards said, we would really like for you to stop dictating curriculum. That is a local decision, and we know what works best in our schools. And the vice chair of K-12 said, well, when have we ever done that? When have we ever passed curriculum mandates? Less than 2.5 weeks later, last Thursday, on the House floor, Senate bill had changed. I don't really remember the number now. Now it's 2362, House Bill 20. It's a sub. And it dictates that every single school district in the state of Kansas, in any curriculum, any course or instruction that touches human growth, human development, or human sexuality will include a 3-minute video on fetal development. So less than 2.5 weeks after the school boards came to us and said, there's one thing you could do is not pass curriculum mandates. And I want to ask you, how do you think this 3-minute fetal development video is going to improve reading scores? That is a cultural issue. It is a Kansans for Life scored vote on whether you are going to dictate that schools have a 3-minute video on fetal development in their classroom. So we need to put action behind our words. When we ask what school boards need, we need to listen, and then not 2.5 weeks later, run roughshod right over them.
And on this next question, Senator Shane, I really thought you had read my notes, but so I'm gonna first start with you, Brett, because you used to work in a more suburban area, and now you live in KCK. So how do the needs of students from different areas of Kansas, whether that's rural, urban, or suburban, differ? And in what ways are these differences most significant?
Well, I think you can see a diversity of needs even within a single school district. So I live in the Kansas City, Kansas area. I taught in the Olathe area, and just in the community of Olathe, you have schools that are higher poverty or much higher income areas. You have, as a former ELL teacher, I worked in a building where we had 21 different native languages, and then you'll have some where there might be 2 or 3. This is one of the great challenges of public education. I think Senator Shane touched on this before, is how do you craft policy and that balance of local control versus some of those state standards that meets the needs of everyone. I think one of the ways the legislature traditionally has tried to do this, and certainly no solution is perfect, but done a pretty good job on, is coming up with a funding formula that tries to acknowledge those different needs across different communities, that doesn't just rely solely on, well, this is a wealthy community, so they can afford nice things for their program, whether their students are higher need or not, and tries to balance that out. Look, you see differences across lived experience, levels of trauma experienced by students, language needs. I don't know that this is necessarily urban, suburban, and rural, but different special education caseloads. There is just a unique combination of challenges that each region, but really each individual district faces. And it makes for tough work, especially for those local boards and the state board and the legislators, and trying to craft policy that's flexible enough to accommodate for that, but holds, like we're talking about accountability and standards that allows everybody to meet those standards, right? To allow every student to have that chance to succeed. So I think the best attempts to reach that have been through funding. That's certainly not the only answer, but that is one of the biggest challenges you see across differing places.
And Senator Shane, coming from a more rural area, what are your thoughts on these varying differences and the one-size-fits-all approach?
Yeah, so Lewisburg is a commuter community to the Kansas City Metro, and so our challenges there are different than some of our other rural communities. Miami County is still a growing county. We have fairly controlled growth, a little over 1% year over year, but most of the counties in Kansas are continuing to shrink in size. I think it's some 90 counties in Kansas will shrink another 50% in population before the next census, and so that's a real challenge and a real struggle, because you have shrinking tax base, you have shrinking enrollment, and you have aging facilities, but you still have kids that have that educational need in those communities. And that's, I think, where we see a lot of our, so a lot of my representatives and senators that represent a lot of the counties in the central and the western part of our states, even the southeastern part of the state. Those are a lot of the struggles that, the districts that are out there become front of mind. I was talking to an individual who's a Board of Education member that they can't get a bond issue passed, and they literally have regular flooding within their building. And talk about negatively impacting the educational environment of that facility. And so balancing those interests and those needs becomes really tough, especially when the cost to build stuff these days is incredible. And we have, I can't remember the exact number, but we have a number of school districts in Kansas that have fewer than 100 children in the entire school district. And so administratively, fiscally, that all creates a lot of challenges and a lot of strain. The best thing I think that we need to do, so I'm a very analytical individual. I love having real data and information, because then it allows us to probe and ask questions and try to get to the root cause of why, right? So I'll give a very brief example. We talk about the teacher shortage a lot in the whole country, right? But what's interesting is that when you look at the pupil to teacher ratio in Kansas, 10 years ago it was 15-1, and today it's 15.2-1. Hasn't changed in 10 years. And so I sit back and I say, I believe that there's some sort of challenge that we're seeing with personnel and personnel management and time management, but let's try to get to the root of what the problem is, because the number says that the number of teachers per pupil in Kansas has not changed in a decade. So how do we better characterize and understand this challenge and this problem? Because I'm not going to dismiss it and say that it's not a real challenge and a real problem. Similarly, that's where we have to get with our budget process and the understand of expenditures and spending in our public schools is how do we get a better grip on what's handling? As another example, special education spending in Kansas. The range of incremental special education spending per special education student in Kansas ranges from $8,000 to $23,000 in incremental spend per student in Kansas. And so as a policymaker, I have to sit back and I have to say, why is there this huge range of incremental spend in special education? But also functionally and fundamentally, what challenges does that create when we think about formula processes and allocation processes and weighting factors and all of that? And so that's really where I see our greatest opportunity is to try to come to more informed decision-making based off of data and using that data to drive and try to implement important policy questions. And that's going to help us solve the challenges of rural district versus suburban district versus urban district, and even within those communities, the challenges that are faced even between school buildings within those districts.
And Representative Poskin, you also bring in sort of like a higher education, seeing these students after they've graduated. How do you view these differences based on region?
So again, my colleagues have both explained that, we've got districts with 100 and, there's over 100 languages just spoken in my district. So I do think that goes back to the local control. I was a Republican for 35 years, and one of my absolute favorite tenets of the GOP platform is that local control should always be preferred. So I think that those challenges are best faced and best expressed to the legislature by our local school boards, and then you've got the state school board that have the different areas. And so to me, that is why the legislature needs to stay in its lane and let the local school districts deal and bring us their solutions to the state legislature. From the higher education perspective, you do get students with a lot of varying abilities, and a lot of, I actually have a credential from UCLA in college admissions advising, and so I did that for several years before I joined the legislature. And there is a whole nother language associated with higher education pursuit. And a lot of our families are not fluent in FAFSA, they're not fluent in prerequisites, they aren't fluent in standardized testing, they aren't fluent in career choices and perhaps matches and so forth. So at the higher education level, when you get to a large institution like KU, you're going to have students coming from all over the state who have experienced very different secondary educations. And I think we need to remain flexible about that. Particularly from a workforce development perspective, I do also work on the Commerce Committee. And, we've got this brain drain in Kansas. And that wasn't really where you were going with that, but I couldn't help but say that. It's just our youth, our K-12 and our college students are the greatest asset. They're our biggest hope for the future. And so we've got to make sure that we are getting them to the appropriate place with the appropriate background that they need to succeed. I know there's been some talk about remedial needs at higher education institutions. Well, that is what it is. And I can tell you, having worked at Johnson County Community College for, 8, 9, 10 years, that can be dealt with, and that very successful students move on when they have that piece. And one of the things that I want to say about that is that some of that is definitely a literacy issue problem that comes from the teacher education programs that moved away from what we are calling now the science of reading, or the letters and that type of thing. So the State Board of Education started making a commitment to that in the 20-teens, and we know how to fix that. And we have stripped the funding. Just on Friday, we got a letter from the State Board, and Kansas Department of Education got a letter saying that the ESSER funds that have already been committed, and I talked with a State Board of Ed member today, and they think they've got, that number is about $10 million dedicated to helping our teachers know how to teach reading. And that's been stripped as of Friday. We are not funding the Blueprint for Literacy. It was groundbreaking legislation last year. I think your predecessor was one of the forces behind it. And we have now stripped them of $40 million. So we've got to keep our promises and our commitments so that our children do come out of K-12 with what they need and all of the tools that they need to succeed in whatever their post-secondary plans are, from technical, career, military, to 4 years and beyond.
And we'll be moving into audience questions in just a few minutes, so keep thinking. And if you're part of our virtual audience, you can send your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. But I wanted to make sure we got in this question before we turned it over to our audience. So we've discussed a lot of the differences that exist within education policy. What opportunities have you seen, or do you hope to see, to create policies and practices that involve a variety of viewpoints? Starting with you, Senator Shane.
I think that's an interesting question. One of the things I'm passionate about, and I think the audience has heard me say this, is how do we get to a position of taking more informed policy decisions and having good visionary policy setting practices. One of the challenges, and this is true in any business or wherever you're at in life, is many times people are focused on the fire that's burning in front of them, and it becomes very, very challenging to look to the future. And I think that's, if I had my druthers, that's really where we would try to shift our focus is, yeah, we have these fires that are burning, but we need to look to the future and say, how do we create a sustainable future, particularly for public schools in Kansas, right? And a lot of that is going to be getting better data and information around, the current state of affairs. What is currently happening? Because that allows us to ask better questions and to come up with better solutions. And I think that's going to be imperative for us because at current pace, right now, the state, we obligate ourselves to a cost of, to a CPIU adjustment every year, so an inflationary increase in education every year. We're increasing education spending by about $200 million this year and increasing special education another 10 million. And that will go on in perpetuity, but not for any other reason other than inflation. I think that our educators and our students deserve us to be a bit more intentional and strategic in how we craft the financing and funding mechanisms for public education in Kansas. So the opportunity for the stakeholders to come to the table is going to be to center around the data and information that I think we need to make available to all the stakeholders and be really incredibly transparent about what's happening in our current system.
And Representative Poskin, what opportunities have you seen?
Well, again, as the appropriators, I think that's where we have the most influence. And I want you to really think about a couple of facts about public school funding in the state of Kansas. The last time that the legislature funded special education at 92% of excess cost, which is what is in our statute, was 2011. The year 2011 is the last time that we did that. And then we've been in this major court battle over the constitutionality of general funding for our schools. And so if you think about that, we have not had a class graduate fully funded both constitutionally and with special ed because they take that off the top. We are required. The reason our Constitution doesn't talk about special education funding is because there was no such thing when our Constitution was written. Special ed became a federal requirement in 1974. So if you know somebody who started school after 2011 or graduated shortly thereafter, they did not experience K-12 fully funded in the state of Kansas. The senator talks about the money that we've added for CPU. Keep in mind that the Supreme Court of the state of Kansas had to retain jurisdiction over that funding because the legislature showed its true colors over and over again by pulling back on funding and not following the rules. So we have added more, but the first year of fully funded constitutional schools, keeping in mind that the special ed was still lagging behind at 70-some%, is the year 22-23. The formula does not go on in perpetuity. In fact, it comes up for rediscussion in 2027. If we kept it exactly the same and met the commitment that we started last year in an election year and then promptly dropped to bring special education funding up to 92%, it would be the year 2035 before we have a graduate from the state of Kansas who went K-12 in a fully funded education system. And I think that is foremost what our job is as the legislature. And until we do that, it's really difficult to talk about us having policy edicts that we think are going to make education appropriate and fair for all Kansas students.
And moving over to you, Brett, what opportunities have you seen from a more educator?
I think as analytical folks and people who like to dig into the policy, sometimes there can be this perspective of, okay, if we tweak this, we fix all these pieces, then we'll be good, right? It'll be set and we can keep going. Part of the challenge in public education is it's affected by so many other things. Senator Shane referenced 90, maybe more than 90 of 105 counties are losing population, right? Mm-hmm. That is not necessarily education driven, but it's a reality that the education system has to deal with. So there are going to be things that make the atmosphere more challenging for any number of reasons outside of just what do we do with education policy. I think right now in general we're in a time where we have sort of a wavering respect for institutions societally, and my hope is that there's, maybe we're in the valley with that, but as we eliminate some of those, people may begin to see the need and as communities say, hey, we really value this. So there are always going to be sort of some of those headwinds. I do think one of the unique opportunities right now, because educators are in demand, is that districts that come up with ways to support their educators, to have innovative programs for students and be places where educators want to work, are just going to out-recruit their peers. And I hope that their peers take notice of that. I work with several districts, and I certainly notice the teachers that I work with are going, wow, this is a great place to work, and we feel supported for all these reasons, and places where that's less so. And I think some of those trends will hopefully create some best practices that we can adopt more broadly. I do also want to touch on part of the opportunities with public education. I know, especially as state legislator, it's more than 50% of the budget, right? It feels like this thing that just, it's always more and more to be spent on. But that, as Mary Lynn touched on, some of that funding really launches some of those innovative programs and opportunities. The funding formula as it stands now, its sort of foundation was in 1992. It's been tweaked in a few ways since then. But we're just talking about keeping up with inflation. Right now, the base aid per pupil is what the formula is it's built on. And that term might be outdated now. I can't remember if you guys have updated that. But basically, the one student with no extra weightings right now in the formula is somewhere around $5,300. If you had, in 1992, when you put that formula into place, just kept up with inflation till today, it'd be over $8,000. I think the inflation adjustment this year for the entire state is in the 200 million range. If you just kept up with inflation from 1992, one district that I work with, given a large one, Olathe, would have $100 million more in their budget. Mary Lynn touched on the special education funding piece of that. Olathe, I think, is one of the top districts that has to transfer money from their general fund budget to fund the needs in special education. It's tens of millions of dollars. And that's, again, that is not all on the state. The state gap looks bigger because the federal government's gap is pretty big at this point as well. But I think it can be easy to get lost in, well, it's just more money, it's more money. But the money does fund those things. It funds those innovative programs and that focus on literacy or really micro-targeting some of those needs. And when the money runs dry, it makes the job of those local board members impossibly hard because you can see the needs, but you're just trying to stretch, the resources more and more thin. So, look, we are a resilient state and a resilient nation, and I think there's always the opportunity for new ideas and capturing those and finding ways to improve. I think we are in challenging times, but the piece that does give me optimism is people care about their community schools, and if they see challenges, they run for the school board or they get on the phone with their state legislators. And I think we need to see more of that to sort of propel us forward and build on some of those successes. But I think fundamentally that is something that people just value, especially in the state of Kansas. And I'm hopeful that they will keep showing up to support that.
All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to the audience. We have a couple of students with microphones, so if you have a question, raise your hand and they will come over to you. Just a brief reminder that they will keep a hold of the microphone and to ask just one brief question. All right, so we can start there in the back.
Hi, I have a question for Senator Shane. So as a public educator, if you ask most gen ed public educators what they think the biggest problem in education right now is, they would say class size. And so something that really caught my attention was your ratio and how 10 years ago it was a 15-to-1 student to teacher ratio, and now it's 15.2-to-1. So really there hasn't been any change. But it feels like we're drowning in the number of students in our class. And I think this happens at the district level too, where we have title schools who receive more funding, so their class sizes are smaller, where I have 30 kids in my class. Mm-hmm. And so my question is, what policies or funding initiatives are being taken to ensure more equitable ratio of students to teachers, and also like how is the state going to support local boards and being more reactive to those population shifts and changes. We have schools closing and populations being shifted to different places, and then our class sizes that I teach at the biggest school in Lawrence, and it is still at capacity. So what is the state working on towards that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And that's a great question. And I hope that you heard me say that I don't dismiss that I think that there's a real challenge there, but the measure of students to teachers doesn't reflect whatever the challenge is. So how do we better characterize what the challenge is? And I think that's a really important part of it. You hit on a very challenging dynamic of the role between the legislature and the boards of education. And where do we have local control versus when do we have a state edict? There's been a lot of conversations. Over the years, teachers have largely not been the beneficiaries of increased education funding in Kansas, but certainly we have grown the number of administrators and the number of non-certified staff. And that's a reality, but teachers have not largely been the beneficiaries of that. But would it be appropriate for the legislature to go in and create an edict to say, you must do this with teacher salaries, right? And then you get into that local control conversation. And it's always a challenging, I would say at times the state's probably been a little bit inconsistent on its view on where is this a local control issue, where is this not? I think that's an interesting challenge of how do we create at least a better framework for boards of education to make good, sometimes a personnel decision, right? But also to have an adaptive learning environment where we can better manage those student loads. Because my sister was a elementary educator. She's now an instructional coach, and she had those experiences where I think one year she had over 30 students in an elementary classroom. And so those are really very real things. But it's about equipping the administration, but also the Board of Education to have the tools in hand that they need to make an informed decision. It's really challenging as a Board of Education member to get a really good, firm grasp on exactly how money is spent in the district and what that looks like, because for many boards of education, you're there once a month on a Monday evening. It's volunteer. It's free. You're not a educator. Well, not always. Sometimes we have educators that are board of education members, but this is a new journey for you many times, right? And being able to, you don't want to get into the weeds too much, but you're kind of like an executive board, as it were, right? And if you're an executive board of a company, you need to have a good general grasp on what's happening in the field and then structure policies around how do we be adaptive and solve those problems. So exactly what that looks like on a statutory basis, I'm not sure what that looks like. The legislature has tried to put in edicts, statutory edicts, 65% of the general fund budget must be spent on instruction or requirements around at-risk. Those laws are rarely followed by school districts, certainly to a T. Sometimes they're not hardly followed at all, but it's a challenging dynamic of the role between legislature and Board of Education.
Other questions?
I don't know if this, okay, so Chris Kobach joined other states in the lawsuit. What are your thoughts on that? I think it's section 504 for special ed, I think. Is that right?
I can take that because I actually did a press conference about that. In my caucus, he joined Texas v. Becerra, and in that lawsuit, it calls for the elimination of Section 504, which is it's not IEPs, but it's 504 plans, and it helps not only disabled students, but it also creates access for people like my husband who's in a wheelchair full-time, that there has to be a machine at the doctor's office that he can get into. And so, yes, he did join that lawsuit. We called on him to withdraw Kansas from that. They did not do that, but they did adjust the lawsuit. So we had a big press conference. We sent him a letter, and there, I believe, were 17 states that joined that to declare it unconstitutional and unenforceable, that whole section. That actually, Senator Dole was quite a big part of turning into law in the 1970s. And so we asked him to withdraw. They did not do that, but they modified and said that in the actual relief section, it said they wanted to have that be declared unconstitutional and unenforceable. They are trying to backtrack and say that that's not what they ever intended, but the text, I'm not a lawyer, the text is there and it does say that. So that has been modified for now. We don't know, that doesn't mean they can't modify it and go back. So I will tell you that on the K-12 Budget Committee and my colleagues who are education-minded, we are absolutely watching that. And it was awful, and it's not on his website that he even was doing it. And so that's a really big problem for our most vulnerable and for the people that Senator Dole worked so hard to protect. Thank you for the question. And you guys might have something to add, but that was something that I actually worked on this session.
Another question right up here.
Hi, I think you're really, when you talk about improving education by coordinating with families and improving the early childhood developmental environment where child care is high quality, but parents also need to know what they need to do. I was a school social worker. I visited a lot of families that were in trouble. I can tell you there's a lot of working class families that will say things like, well, I feed them and clothe them. You educate them. They don't know the importance of those early years, so they're not developmentally aware of what they need to do to really prepare their children. So I think you've got something when you say one of the big things we can do is improve the quality of early child care and the knowledge that parents have about what they can do to cultivate their children. The other one, as a former education researcher, the other question I have is about the teachers, what they're paid compared to other countries, how they're selected. You can look at Finnish models. You can look at other models. They're paying enough that they're attracting the highest talent in their societies to become teachers. And of course, they get fabulous results. Our teachers, when they go to college for 4 years, they're getting 70% of the pay that someone that would go into another field would get. So what can we do to improve those two areas? I see those as being crucial if we really want to see improved results.
Whoever wants to take that one first.
It's a tough question. Thank you for that. Ultimately, the folks that have the tightest control over what teachers get paid are boards of education. But you've also heard that there's also challenges in managing the school district budget, right? Increasingly so in Kansas. The way that school finance was originally designed and envisioned was that it was largely locally funded and largely local, a local effort. And now the balance has shifted where there's a very significant state component to the funding mechanism, right? So it's this very interesting challenge that exists as far as who can be the most helpful to addressing teacher pay, teacher benefits. And there's little bites at the apple that we can take. I introduced a bill this year to try to roll teachers from KPERS 3 to KPERS 2. It comes with a big fiscal note, but I think that retirement packages are an important component of teacher retention. At the end of the day, I get back, I'm going to keep coming back to my central theme of data and trying to get a better understanding of what the ground truth is. In Kansas, on average, our districts are expending around $19,000 per student. So some people say, well, that doesn't seem like enough. Others say that seems like way too much. And I think the truth is that maybe we really don't know. And we need to try to get a better understanding of what are the true financial resources that are necessary per student, per child, to have them successfully complete an education, especially in our public schools. And that helps inform the teacher salary question. To your point on what happens in other countries, it's true with a lot of government positions as well. I'll speak from the veterinary perspective. There's a lot of veterinary government jobs, particularly in Europe. We make wisecracks in this country all the time about, if you can't, just go work for the government, right? And in other countries, those government jobs are actually the most respected and are very well compensated and pensioned positions. And so it's they're held in different esteem, and it's a much more competitive competitive pool of applicants. And so, what the solution looks like, I'm not entirely sure, but it's a difference that does exist between our country and certainly others. But I think we need to get a really good grip on understanding the true financial requirements on a per-child basis educating, and then that helps us inform, well, okay, this was good, this was good, this was good. Maybe this we can tweak a bit, and then now we really need to answer the question on teacher compensation.
Can I make one? The Department of Education cut its, the Department of Education, our State Department, cut its research department, and I think it was 2007. They don't have researchers. You want data, they don't have people to do the job. So I don't know where you're getting your data, but it's a very thin staff to provide those kinds of things.
And if I may provide a little follow-up, I was surprised to hear the statistic of 15 students per class in the 1990s and 15.2. And I think that data could maybe be dug into a little deeper because we have such a higher population of higher special ed needs, so that maybe we've got 4 teachers in a classroom with 4 kids, and that's how we get 30 in your elementary class. So data is incredibly important. And one thing about teacher pay, so one of the things that I was really proud to get across the line in my first term was doubling the Kansas Teacher Service Scholarship that would help eliminate student loans if students decided to teach in Kansas, because we were only funding half of those eligible applicants. And in doing some of that research through KLRD, our Legislative Research Department, I came across the Kansas Teacher Retention Initiative out of Emporia State University, and Kansas actually has more data, more complete data on what drives our teachers' satisfaction with their careers than any other state in the nation. It is an incredible tool that we have been working on gathering data on, and it's interesting because the number one driver really isn't pay. I don't know a teacher who ever went into education because they thought they were going to get rich, and I'm not saying that we don't need to pay them, please, do not misconstrue my thoughts, but we have very deep dives into data about what it is that's driving teacher engagement and retention, and I will tell you that a lot of it is the demonization in in the media. It's our schools are failing, our teachers are indoctrinating, and that is difficult. And then we put these additional requirements on them, the unfunded, now we've got the 3-minute fetal video. There was a bill that I don't think will make it across the floor that, tells teachers what pronouns they can use and what nicknames they can use for students. And as part of research, I asked KLRD, how many school-age students are named Elizabeth? Because this bill that passed the Senate but hasn't passed the House would require teachers to only use names and derivatives of birth certificate names without parental permission, right? So if your nickname is, Kitty and your name is Elizabeth and the parent says it's okay, but there are 7,550 school-age girls enrolled in the state of Kansas whose first or middle name is Elizabeth. There are 158 derivations of that name, including Eli. So now we're going to task that's one name. 7,550 girls in Kansas schools with a first and middle name Elizabeth. So we have to, it's more than pay, pay is important, but we've got to respect our teachers and let them do what they have been professionally trained to do. The other piece that I wanted to touch on was our early learning. So Senator Pat Petty from KCK and part of Johnson County and I head up the Early Learning Caucus, and we bring educators in, we bring Head Start in, we bring all of the early programs, and we would love to get universal pre-K. Our children are not coming as prepared to be learners as they might have been a few years ago. And one of the things that is my least favorite on the GOP platform is that it says that we are no longer going to subject our children to social emotional learning. It's actually on the GOP platform, but there's data that shows when you address the social emotional learning aspect of our students and they are more prepared to learn, they're going to be more successful. So I think that's a perspective to keep in mind as well. So we've got our Head Start, we've got our home visits. We have had 3 presentations that Senator Petty and I worked on with Kansas Action for Children. I'm going to leave everybody out who is a big piece of that. And they come and they tell the legislature what they need and what we can do to better prepare our families and our children to be successful in school.
I just want to really briefly comment on that. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Mary Lynn touched on that incredible survey out of Emporia State on teacher retention.
It's awesome.
And it does touch on public perception of educators, but I don't think that we can divorce that for pay. I mean, for better or worse, in American society, we use pay as a way of deeming this job as important or, you know, esteemed in such a way. And so we have this combination where they are being paid less, and then, you know, despite taking a career path of service to make less, then also being demonized. And then very quickly on the early childhood, I think one of the things that helps, and the work that you did gets to this, if we're engaging families earlier in that process and making the schools in their community a resource to them. Because one of the challenges in parent engagement is not every parent had a great experience with school when they were in school, and they might find that setting not a place that they are inclined to engage with. And so one of the added benefits of doing that critical early work is making those connections, building the relationships with parents, and being a resource to them that says, hey, we want to empower you to, you know, be the most engaged parent in your child's success that you can be.
And then we have one question from the online.
All right, so our online question is, what role does school choice have in public education, and how does state funding play a part in school choice?
Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in, and then I'll
Go
let
right
the current politicians take it. I'll say, first and foremost, school choice has failed every time it's been put up for a public vote anywhere in America, red states, blue states. It is not a popular issue with voters. I think the most recent states to vote it down, if I remember right, was Nebraska, just to our north. So as a baseline, I think that's pretty important when we talk about what, you know, a significant change in public education policy like that. We've talked about all of the challenges that go into making our public schools as strong as possible and that balance. None of that gets any easier when you start draining the funds available to them. A lot of the communities in Kansas, all a school choice bill would do is drain the funding because there is no other school to choose to send your students to. I will also say that in general, there's not a level playing field when it comes to you know, voucher bills or the landscape. Public schools, by their nature, are there to serve anyone and everyone in the community. We don't hold private schools to those standards. We don't hold them to the same accreditation standards. We don't hold them to the same standards on receiving and providing for every single student. So I'll let the current legislators hit more of the details, but I guess the main points I want to put on are people don't like it. It drains funds from the current school, even if it's not directly from the formula, from the general fund. And it makes all of the challenges that we face more difficult because public schools are the foundation and they are serving everyone, even when private schools do not.
To piggyback on that, I ran on public dollars for public schools. Our K-12 and really our public school system is a public good. Whether you got your real tax dollars worth out of it with 7 kids going to those public schools, or you had 0 kids going to those public schools, the people who serve your meal at a restaurant, the people who check you in at your doctor's office, the lawyers who serve you are educated, and it is a public good. There are not other public goods where you're like, you know what, I think instead of using the school library, I'm going to ask for a voucher to go to Barnes and Nobles. That's not how it works. When you make a private choice to go to a private school, that is a budgetary commitment that you make. In our Kansas Constitution, it's actually a part of it, Article 6, Section 6, that says that no public education funds will be in control of sectarian organizations. So that is a provision that what we've done in the state of Kansas is used a shell game. And a lot of legislators say we don't have vouchers. We do. In 2014, we established a tax credit scholarship where it is a shell game. So donors give money to a scholarship granting organization who then disperses scholarships for kids to go to private school. And then the next argument that they make is that that's not a voucher and that it's not tax dollars. But the way it works is that for every dollar that you give to that tax or to the scholarship granting organization, 75 cents of your tax liability does not in fact go to the state general fund to fund the services that we are required. So it costs you 25 cents on the dollar to sweep your money into private school that the state is not required to fund. So the other thing that's very interesting about that is that that was established in 2014, and it's called the Low Income Tax Credit Scholarship, but there is already a category of unlimited income. If you qualify for it once, and then your parents win the lottery, or they graduate from med school and go on to make $300,000 or $400,000 a year, you will be eligible for the rest of your life. That tax credit scholarship has been expanded 10 times since 2014. The cap, the eligibility, always moving it forward. It used to be free lunches. It's moving up every year. This year they tried to add 3 new categories of unlimited income. And so it is a vehicle to go to a universal voucher scheme. The best amendment I haven't been able to run yet was to change the name of that to the taxpayer-assisted private school scholarship, because that's what it is. We haven't heard it on the House floor this year. In my knowledge, this is the first year that we may be able to stop that expansion. 3 new categories with unlimited income, and I was able to prove that you could be an Army colonel in Leavenworth making $120,000 a year and have a spouse with unlimited income and rake in $8,000 a year for private school scholarships. In my own district, you could be a Leawood fire captain and be married to an executive at one of my many, many big companies and get $8,000 a year. This year there was another bill that passed on the Senate side but not our side that would give you an $8,000 tax credit if you did not send your children to public school. In committee, I was able to prove that we didn't fund a $40,000 School for the Blind extended year program in Dodge City, but a family in Dodge City with 6 children in the Catholic school would clear $43,000 on that tax credit after paying tuition. So it was amended to be just tuition, but we've got to remember we have been hearing a lot about our budget and that we are already looking at out years of negative balances. We cannot subsidize private school choices and hurt the amount of money in our state general fund that is available to do all the necessary government issues. I have lovingly and pridefully earned the nickname in my community of the voucher killer. So I will stand on that all day, every day.
So school choice can mean a lot of different things, and it's important to be specific, I think, when you're talking about what kind of a school choice initiative are you talking about? So are you talking about open enrollment in public schools? Are you talking about the establishment of education savings accounts? Are you talking about conventional voucher systems? So it's important, I think, to be specific about what you're talking about from a policy perspective, because school choice can mean a lot of different things. And a lot of them are bad policies, to be quite frank. A lot of the school choice policies out there are bad. But something that we do know is good, and something that we recognize in this country that is good, is competition. And so creating an educational environment that fosters competition, even between public schools, right, I think goes to the broader benefit. There's two systems in our country that suffer from a lack of competition. That's healthcare and education, right? And I think it's important that we ask the question of how do we promote and enhance competition to help improve progressive and innovative outcomes? And that's the important question. So for me as a policymaker, that's what I'm looking at. If we think about every tax credit or every scholarship as stealing from the public schools, well, we've got $8.2 billion of exemptions and tax incentives on the table in Kansas. But we're only crying about a scholarship or a tax credit that goes to the child whose family's made a private school investment decision. I think that we need to be fair when we're talking about impacts to the state general fund. And we have to have a transparent conversation because we have a lot of economic incentive and exemptions on the table. I, for one, think we should have a hard look at those and determine which ones have been valuable for the state because it does have an impact on tax receipts for our state. And it's an important question going forward. But I don't think that we need to impugn necessarily tax credits where somebody wants to make a private school investment. I agree with the representative that the scholarship program probably could be renamed. So that it more accurately conveys what it's doing, and we can be fair and have a good conversation about that. And transparently, you know, my kids are right now in private school, and it was actually me on the Senate side that looked at the proposal that was on the table for this session and said, well, hold on just a second, guys. This tax credit would actually exceed what my kids' tuition is, so that doesn't make any sense. That's not a good bill for the people of Kansas. So if this is going to go through, that at least needs to be fixed because that's a huge problem. That's a huge red flag. We have to sit back, and I think we need to have a fair look at it. And we need to determine what does sound education, public school funding look like, right? Our state was called to invest in our state's educational, scientific, vocational, and intellectual interests. One of those mechanisms is public schools. But the educational interests of the state and the systems to achieve that can mean a lot of different things. And I view that individual right to an education, that is an individual right to the child that our state secures. Collectively, we invest in public education, but the right belongs to the child. So when it comes to school choice programs, I'm not a blanket, I'm for all school choice programs, but I do think we can have our cake and eat it too and come up with sound solutions that allow families to try to make the best decisions for themselves while also making sure that our public schools are in the position that they need to be. And I hope that's where we can get, because I think competition is a good thing and giving people choices is also a good thing.
All right, thank you guys all for joining us this evening. It has been a very lovely conversation, and safe travels home.
Thank you for coming.